Can CETA be saved? The EU trade deal with Canada is at risk following objections from Belgium's French-speaking parliament. Critics say global corporate interests will benefit most. So will the deal be renegotiated? And how does it affect the worldwide reputation of the EU? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. It's the classic tale of David versus Goliath. There's Wallonia, the French-speaking region of Belgium, which makes up less than 1% of the population of the European Union. Then there's the EU itself. Wallonia seems to be winning. The tiny population has rejected a trade deal between Canada and the EU. It's known as CETA. In doing so, Wallonia derailed an agreement in the making for 7 years, and which has the approval of every other country in the EU. Opposition to the deal spread across Belgium after Wallonians complained. And although Belgian government leaders support the deal, they say they can't approve it without support from the people. Duncan Goliath reports from Namur in Wallonia.
From small farms to big towns, the people of Wallonia have been determined to stop CETA. In capitals across Europe, the objections of farmers like Françoise are being heard. She argues the EU's trade deal with Canada sacrifices too much and benefits too few.
All that will survive will be industrial farming with low-cost products, harming the environment and the quality of food, and jobs. Many jobs will disappear.
Her concerns are shared by Frédéric Gillot. He voted against CETA in the regional parliament. Like many lawmakers here, he's worried about the treaty's system for resolving disputes.
From our point of view, these tribunals will benefit multinational companies. We firmly reject that. We have our laws, we have our tribunals. It's more than enough.
If you want to know why Wallonians are suspicious of globalization, look no further than the crumbling steel plants of Charleroi. This region was once one of the industrial heartlands of Belgium. Wallonia became rich on steel and coal production, but heavy manufacturing has been in decline for decades. It means more people are without jobs here than in other parts of Belgium. But there could be new jobs at this factory if the trade deal gets signed. Stuve has been making fireplaces for 30 years and is investing in new designs using renewable energy. Its founder wants to expand, so what better market than cold Canada?
For my business, it would make it easier to have relationships with Canada. We have a subsidiary over there. We'd like to produce our stoves in Canada, and anything that can facilitate our freedom to do business with Canada is positive.
But for now, the left-wing politicians of southern Belgium are siding with voters like Françoise. They believe they're standing up for workers not just here, but right across Europe. Duncan Goliath, Al Jazeera, Namur in Wallonia.
So the CETA deal was meant to be signed this Thursday. That's unlikely to happen now because of deadlock in Belgium. Negotiations began in 2009. Under the deal, almost all tariffs between Canada and the EU will be eliminated. Supporters say CETA will boost transatlantic trade and small businesses. Critics say it will weaken health, environmental, as well as other protection standards. Let's talk about this. Bring in our guests. In Brussels, we have Friends of the Earth Europe trade campaigner Fabian. Over in Berlin, we have Scott Sinclair. He's a senior fellow at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. In Washington, D.C., we have Hosukli Makiyama. He's the director of the European Centre for International Political Economy. Welcome to you all. If I can start off with Hosukli Makiyama in Washington, are Wallonians' concerns over this trade agreement warranted? Some of them, as you heard in the report, saying that this is just a bad deal for Europe's farmers and it just gives too much power to global corporate interests.
I think most of the concerns are actually completely unjustified, partly because if you look at the agreement, it will not affect those sectors in the way they are actually portraying it to be in the media. If you look at the agriculture sectors and if you look at the small and medium-sized businesses, they are actually the gainers of this deal. And what we've seen now is not so much about concern about globalization and free trade. This is basically domestic Belgian politics.
Fabian, is this domestic Belgian politics? I mean, is there a regional political fight going on here, or is there a real concern that businesses will have too much power?
No, I think this is a concern that is shared by many, many people across Europe and by many parliamentarians and governments indeed as well. We've seen over the last month a lot of very strong national debates on CETA and its contents, and there have been concerns raised in a large number of EU countries, including Austria, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Slovenia, Poland and Hungary. So these are widespread concerns, and they go right to the heart of the matter of the deal, which is that it would indeed give more power to large corporations at the expense of our democracies and at the expense of people and the environment.
At the same time, Scott Sinclair, you do have some who do support CETA as it stands. In fact, you have the rest of the European nations that do support it. From your understanding, without agreement from all of Belgium's regions, can Belgium actually sign CETA?
It's a very fluid situation. It's not clear if Belgium is in a position to sign, but I'd just like to point out that trade barriers between Canada and the European Union are already very low. Trade is very open. The parts of this deal which are most controversial are those which give special rights to foreign investors to sue over public policies, which increase the cost of drugs, particularly in my country, and restrict the flexibility of governments at all levels, including even the local level, to enhance and expand public services. And these are the concerns that the Wallonian government is expressing, and they are shared, as Fabian has alluded to, by many Europeans and indeed many Canadians.
But on the official Canadian government level, Scott Sinclair, you have the trade minister who is saying that she's describing this deal as the most progressive trade deal ever negotiated. Do you agree with that?
No, I find that difficult to agree with. We have a new government in Canada, but this trade deal was negotiated by our past government, which I think everyone agrees was one of the most conservative governments in recent Canadian memory. So if the Canadian government and the European governments wish to make good on their rhetoric that this is the most progressive trade deal ever, that would require them to go back to the negotiating table and fix the deep flaws with this treaty.
Hosokli Makiyama, is that something that you see happening, going back to the negotiating table? Do you think that Wallonia should be given more assurances when it comes to their concerns to this deal?
Actually, they have already been given every assurance possible from its European neighbors, as well as the European Commission, a leading group of experts, as well as its own legal experts. And the problem here is that the Wallonians are not really concerned about the CETA in itself. And actually, the leader of the parliament, Paul Magnet, has even admitted he hasn't even read the agreement, although it has been available for him for several years. This is not really a concern over CETA as an agreement as such. And if you talk about the question of whether the multinational corporations can actually sue the government, that has basically been dispelled as a myth. It's a non-discrimination clause where the corporations, when they are given a certain right to have market access, not to be discriminated in Canada or Europe, if these rights are being violated, they have the right to actually take it to a tribunal. And this is not something that is of a concern between a country like Canada and the EU. And most disturbing part is that Belgium already has over 100 agreements of this kind.
But when you say assurances have been given to Wallonians, what kind of assurances are you talking about here in particular?
They have been given guarantees that their concerns in regarding the social and labor their right to regulate in terms of social and labor clauses will be maintained. There is not a single chance in the world that a democratic elected government in Europe or Canada would sign away their democracy. It's just not in the table. This is not what free trade agreement does. And if that would be the case, basically even the EU as a construct would not work, because it is built on the idea that we will share our regulation, we will actually share our democracy in Europe. And the question is here not so much about whether Wallonians feel that the EU represent them. This is a question of whether they feel that the Belgian federal government is capable of representing them.
Fabian, let me just cross over to you for a second. And it just seems like this dispute with the EU could sink this entire deal. So do you think that it's fair that a small region like this can block an entire deal when it comes to EU and Canada?
First, I'd like to respond to a few things that were mentioned before. I think it's really unfair to say, and actually not true, that the Wallonian government and the Wallonian parliament haven't looked closely at the deal. In fact, it's one of the regions and parliaments in Europe that has most closely scrutinized this deal, and this is where these concerns come from. There have been several resolutions in the Wallonian parliament closely commenting on the provisions in the CETA agreement, and that's the work that other parliaments haven't done, and that's why these concerns, why governments have been able to signal their agreement to the deal, because it hasn't been scrutinized enough at the national level. I think what Wallonia represents is much more than the 3.4 million citizens that live in its territory. It's really a citizens' movement across Europe that is bigger than any other at the moment, and that is opposing these deals for the reasons I mentioned before, namely that those deals will hand over more power to multinational corporations. So I think the Walloons are really standing up for a large number of the European citizenry, and they have the right to do that. In fact, the Wallonians would be the ones that would face a lot of liabilities under the CETA agreement, because through the investment protection provisions, decisions by the Wallonian government would equally be affected. And so it is their democratic duty to thoroughly look at that deal before they signal their agreement with it.
Scott Sinclair, the European Council President Donald Tusk seems to believe that the summit that was originally planned for Thursday to sign this deal is still possible. Do you?
Anything is possible at this point. As I said, it's a very fluid situation. Our Prime Minister could come to Brussels to sign either the CETA itself, if the Belgian issue can be resolved, which seems unlikely in the next several hours, or to sign a partner agreement, which was to be signed alongside CETA, called an SPA, a Special Partnership Agreement. Or it's quite possible that he will not get on the plane, and that this uncertainty about the CETA deal will carry on for several weeks.
Well, speaking of Justin Trudeau, what's at stake for Canada if this deal does not go through, and why has Trudeau been pushing for it so much?
I think if this deal did not go through, it would have very little impact on Canadian trade or Canadian-European trade. As I said, the barriers are very low. I am not entirely sure why the new government has championed this deal, which was negotiated by the previous government. I believe that our trade minister has shown some flexibility. She negotiated directly with Wallonia and then left in some frustration when the terms of their discussion seemed to have been overturned by the European Commission. So she has rightly said this is an internal European matter that now needs to be resolved. But Canada certainly has a great deal at stake from this agreement. We have had a very bad experience under NAFTA with investor-state dispute settlement, and I hope that the new Canadian government can grasp the opportunity, seize the opportunity to remove these very toxic provisions from the CETA.
And José Makiyama, Donald Tusk also saying that there would be consequences for Europe's global position if it failed to sign this free deal with Canada. How so, if you agree with that statement? And some also speculating that perhaps the EU's reputation as a whole, as a trading bloc, will be damaged by the failure of signing this deal.
Indeed, that's true. Europe actually belongs to some of the most trade-dependent countries in the world. Well, in France, 1/3 of the GDP comes from export. In Germany, it's more than half. So in one sense, you could say that what will happen is that this economic contribution that comes from export is really at risk. In particular, you have to bear in mind that Canada has signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also many Asian countries and many emerging markets are engaging and liberalizing their market and introducing more and more non-discriminatory clauses in their trade. And that means basically that the European trade will be gradually replaced by those other countries. And now, considering that Europe will probably be a zero growth area for many, many years and possibly decades ahead, it means that basically that European welfare cannot longer be maintained unless we can secure this trade that we have now today. And although I do agree that the trade between Canada and Europe is actually relatively open, this is not really what's at stake here. It's actually a question about future trade. And if you look at the global influence of Europe, it is now really at risk. Why would any trade counterpart, or even in agreements that is not in the economic area, let's say, for example, environment, why would you actually do concessions for Europe? Why would you negotiate with Europe unless you're absolutely certain that Europe can hold up its end of the bargain? And this is now really a question about Europe's raison d'être, if you like.
The opposition to CETA is part of a trend against big trade agreements in Europe, particularly one called the TTIP. It's a deal between the European Union and the US. Like CETA, TTIP will lower tariffs and regulations on trade between the EU and US. And that's supposed to result in cheaper goods and services for consumers. But critics say the deal helps big business while harming citizens. And people are angry that TTIP negotiations have been held in secret, which has been an issue with CETA talks as well. Scott Sinclair, first on the issue of these talks being held in secret, why do you think that is? And could this deal be a test model to push through TTIP talks, which, as you know, have been stalled as well?
Well, I think there's certainly a high degree of overlap between the provisions of CETA and TTIP. And I think it's probably true that CETA would never have been as controversial. It certainly wasn't when the negotiations began 8 or 9 years ago. If European public opinion had not become mobilized around the TTIP, and of course, once they looked into that agreement, they began to recognize the similarities in areas like investor-state dispute settlement and regulatory cooperation between the two agreements. And for that matter, as was mentioned before, Canada has signed but not ratified the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and there's a very vigorous debate in Canada about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and our government has not yet taken a position on whether it will ratify. But again, as Canadians have studied the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, they have recognized the similarities and overlaps between it and CETA, and this has led to growing concern.
Fabian, do you agree with that statement that there's overlap between the two trade agreements? And you know, in the case of this backlash against CETA, how much is it a backlash against the fine print in CETA, or is it just this sort of seemingly growing trend that we see towards anti-globalization trade agreements?
So there are certainly a lot of similarities, and I think Scott is clearly right that that's what kind of galvanized public opinion around the two agreements, that they saw the similarities and similar threats emanating from them. I think there's it's not necessarily an anti-globalization movement. It's a movement for a different globalization. And I think the point that Europe is unable to conclude international agreements is just not true. We saw that Europe ratified very quickly, actually, the Paris Agreement on climate change. So when the content of the agreement is less controversial, Europe is capable of quickly ratifying agreement. But I think the most controversial issues are the same for CETA and TTIP, namely that investors would be able to bypass national legal systems and have their privileged forum to challenge all sorts of government measures.
And this is when you're referring to the investor-state dispute
specifically.
specifically.
Both agreements is similarly strong. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the EU has in fact proposed almost exactly the same provisions for investor-state dispute settlement in CETA and in TTIP, and so people have recognized these similarities, and I think that's why there's the high level and high degree of opposition to both agreements.
Hosukli Makiyama, if CETA collapses, and we obviously don't know what's going to happen at this point, could it set a precedent for the collapse of TTIP?
Well, most commentators would say that TTIP has already, well, if not collapsed, at least gone to a temporary halt until there is new government in Washington, as well as maybe a different political constellation in Brussels. And I must say that I don't agree with the view that actually TTIP nor CETA lowers the level of ambition and regulation actually no free trade agreement actually does. What they do is basically where regulation and the regulatory protection and consumer protection overlap, they basically remove redundant double checks. If you have a product that is deemed as okay in Canada, and if the regulatory standard is similar or at least can offer the same protection in Europe, you're basically saying that let's assume for, until proven different, we are going to assume that they are okay for trade. And so with that point of view, it's very difficult to see how the consumer will be at loss. And I have to say that even though I do respect my fellow speaker here on the panel about this not being an anti-globalization movement, but there is certainly a new trend towards anti-globalization and towards actually international cooperation. And the biggest concern here in this matter is that what it leads to is not only higher consumer prices, but it leads to local multinationals. So for example, in Belgium, you have a Belgian industrial giant who will benefit hugely from the fact that the international international competition is kept at bay. This is not about consumers versus multinationals. This is a question about whether governments want to protect their own national giants.
Let me just get Scott Sinclair to weigh in on what our guest from Washington had to say.
Well, it's hard to see the benefits for Canadian consumers, certainly in CETA, when it will force us to extend patent terms, which will increase the cost of drugs, which are already very high in Canada. We pay the third highest per capita drug costs in the developed world. Those increased drug costs will completely wipe out any savings to consumers from the elimination of the remaining small tariffs on European imports into Canada. We have also had as I mentioned before, a very negative experience with investor-state dispute settlement mechanism under NAFTA. We've seen over 30 claims. We've lost many, including non-discriminatory environmental protection policies, which, such as environmental assessment, which have been successfully challenged under this very opaque and unaccountable investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. So, from a Canadian public interest perspective, it seems somewhat absurd to be expanding this without very serious fixes.
All right. On that note, I'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much to all my guests, Fabian Flus, Scott Sinclair, and Hosikli Makiyama. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for watching the program. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.